Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Piper Kendricks-Williams, Chair of African American Studies, and it's my joy to introduce Dr. Leigh-Anne Francis for this next Black History Month lecture. I want to thank the Office of the Division of Inclusive Excellence, the Office of Alumni Engagement, and of course, the Departments of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and African American Studies. I'll turn it over to the incomparable Dr. Francis.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to jump right in. I've been asked to talk to you today, not just about my research and the mass incarceration crisis that's impacting African American, or rather, ensnaring poor Black people and poor Black and Indigenous people of color in general. But I'm asked to talk to you also about what inspired my interest in the topic. So I'll begin there. I'm a historian of Black women prisoners in New York City in the early 1900s. And my interest in the history of Black women prisoners was inspired by my own experiences of racist profiling and its consequences, my own experiences of racism in policing and in the court system. I identify as Black and genderqueer, and I've been arrested 3 times. In one instance, I was assaulted by a state trooper, a white man, who lied about the incident, and there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. His word mattered more than mine. His word mattered so much more than the terror I felt that night as well. It was my race and gender queerness that led police officers over and over and over again to perceive me as suspicious. And I was suspicious because to them, I looked like a Black man. And had they perceived me as a Black cisgender woman or a Black trans person, I still would have been perceived as suspicious. But time and time again, I've been repeatedly stopped by police for no reason, and they're shocked. They're shocked when they hear me speak, because clearly they're surprised that, well, they're reading me as a woman, even though I don't identify as such. In any case, after my first arrest, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm a graduate student, 28 years old, and my girlfriend at the time, a white woman, she used to forget things, and she locked her keys. She locked her keys in her house, and I was outside her house with her, this white woman, my girlfriend, my then girlfriend, and a white male friend of mine. So she locked her keys in the house. It's 4 o'clock in the day. We're in a white suburb in Rochester, New York. And my white male friend climbs a ladder in the side of the house to kick in the window to get in so we could all get in the house. And, I wanted to help. I'll help you, honey. So I climbed the ladder, but stayed on the ladder and watched him kick in the window. I see a police car pull up, and I'm thinking to myself, this is not going to go well, right? I'm scared. I'm already scared, and police officer stops. I come down from the ladder. I step away from the white people, and I'm thinking I'll let them handle it. And so, long story short, my girlfriend, again, who's white, is telling the police officer, this is my name. I locked my keys in the house. He was just trying to get the keys, not me, but our friend. The police officer, he could not take his eyes off me. And I was dressed, I was wearing hoodie and jeans, is wearing clothes that you would find in the men's department, had a baseball cap on, and he just could not take his eyes off me. And so he asked me, just me, questions, and one of them was he wanted to see my ID. And not understanding that this man could kill me on the spot, because this is not something I would do now and not something I ever did again. But he asked me for my ID and I said, why? Because I knew in that moment, I mean, I wasn't climbing through the window. I'm not the only person standing there. Why are you only speaking to me? Clearly, I'm being profiled, right? There are assumptions that are being made about me that are not being made about my friends here. So I asked him why, and he just, let me see your ID, let me see, and I just kept asking him why. And that whole thing ended very dramatically with me. He said, show me your ID or I'm gonna arrest you. And I locked my wrists together and then he clicked the cuffs on and I just started weeping. I just started crying. So it just occurred to me, what is happening now? I am being arrested. And I just remember in my memory, 3 very large white men showing up and hauling me off and slamming me on the back of the trunk. I mean, I think he really made a show, because I had defied his authority. In any case, I was arrested and I had to, I was strip searched, and that was really traumatizing experience to be stripped, to be forced to strip. And I was able to pay the bail. I had to pay a fine, a big fine. And that was it. I became interested in policing and prisons and the experiences of Black people in policing and prisons. And I'll talk a little bit more about my privilege in that situation and how I could be arrested 3 times and end up with a PhD working at a predominantly white college. So after my first arrest, I learned that there was a crisis of mass incarceration impacting poor Black communities. Among the intersecting systems of oppression, there are multiple oppressions that are bearing down on Black people, poor Black people specifically, making it near impossible for poor Blacks to escape poverty. And the intersecting systems of oppression that also fuel stereotypes of poor Blacks as crime prone and poor Black communities as havens of crime. This justifies the over-policing of poor Black communities. It justifies unjust police violence that results in the over-representation of Blacks in prison, results in the disproportionate incarceration of Blacks. So that night when I was arrested, and every time I was arrested, I was able to pay the bail. I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't have savings as a graduate student, but I did have a credit card and I did have a mom that would bail me out. So while my Blackness and my queerness made me a target for police, for racist policing, it was my class privilege, my economic status that did not allow that or prevented those arrests from drastically altering the trajectory of my life. I finished graduate school. I'm able to achieve a level of income stability. And I bring this up because poor Black folks, many poor Black folks are in jails and prison today simply because they can't make bail. They can't pay the bail to get out. And they've done nothing, but they can't pay the bail to get out. Before I continue too, I want to acknowledge that when I talk about, I'm going to talk about what I think of as everyday racist habits of thinking, the everyday racist habits of thinking that drive this hyper policing of poor Black communities. And when I say, everyday racist habits of thinking, I'm not talking about other people. I'm talking about myself too. I'm a Black person. I got a bunch of Black folks in my family. And I have internalized racism. I have internalized white supremacy. So even after I was arrested, and I would be again, I would find myself when I was in poor Black communities, frightened and ashamed of the fact that I'm so frightened, angry that I'm so frightened. What am I scared for? I'm scared of poor Black people. Why? Because they're poor and Black. This is internalized white supremacy. This is internalized white racism. And I went to work on it. It took me years. It took me years to stop locking my car every time a Black man walked by my car. So again, I'm not saying anything. I'm not asking people to think about anything or do anything that I haven't had to do myself. But it is significant that me and the millions of Black folks in this country, while we may have internalized racism in different ways, we are impacted by racist thinking in profoundly different ways than white folks. For example, whether or not a police officer is going to harm me when I come into contact with one isn't the question or the issue. I am terrified that I'm not gonna live through that situation when I come into contact with a police officer, and I am realistically under the threat of death because of how I'm perceived as a Black person. Lots of research shows that police officers are far more likely to misread a Black person as having a weapon or a gun when they don't, and kill them because of it. All right, so my interest in the history of racism, crime in prisons, and Black women prisoners is an effort to understand how everyday racist beliefs that circulate through white media, how poverty and job discrimination, and how discriminatory policing and discrimination in the courts, how these forces produce the overrepresentation of Black people in general in prison and Black women specifically in prison in the past and the present, in order to shed light on the present. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen. Because of I'm so glad that so many of you are here. Because of the number of people that are here, I normally ask questions of people in attendance. I am going to ask those questions, and I'm going to ask you to note your answers, to mentally note them or write them down as I proceed through my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Alex, am I visible as well, not just the slideshow? Okay, thank you, Judah. All right, awesome. I can see Judah, James, Inclusive Excellence. All right. So my presentation is titled Racist Fictions, Racism Realities, African Americans, Mass Incarceration, and Everyday White Supremacy. If I ask you to think about, to imagine the typical drug dealer, what race is that person? What gender is that person? What class status or economic status is that person? Stereotypical drug dealer, stereotypical drug user, the stereotypical person that commits crimes. Who do you think of? Most of us may imagine one type of person. For most of these categories or all of these categories, some of us will imagine somebody different. But pretty typically, when I ask my students this, and I've taught this, I've talked about racism, the intersection of racism, crime, and prisons. I've been teaching it for over roughly 15 years now. And the answers are generally the same. Students, most of whom are white, but they're not the only ones with these stereotypes. But students tend to imagine drug dealers as poor Black men, especially young Black men. Depending on where they live, they might imagine drug users as white, but many imagine drug users to also be poor Black people and poor brown people. And when I ask students who commits most crimes in the country, most of my students every single semester will say that most crimes in this country are committed by Black people. So these stereotypes of drug dealers, drug users, and people who commit crimes in general, how are these beliefs linked to who the police target? The police are human beings. And just like us, they have internalized stereotypes of all kinds. And so how are these beliefs linked to who, and how are these beliefs linked to who the police do not target as well? So if the stereotypical drug user, if people tend to imagine drug users as poor Black men, and if people tend to imagine drug dealers as poor Black men and or young Black men, and if people tend to imagine drug users, crack users, for example, people who use crack, if people tend to imagine them as poor Black people, and if people associate crime with Black folks and think of poor Black communities as cesspools of crime, right? These are examples of everyday racist beliefs because they are rooted in fictions. They are rooted in lies. If I'm generous, I can say misunderstanding. But there are institutional authorities and institutions that spread these beliefs. So those are examples of the everyday racist beliefs that are mainstreamed, that are white supremacist beliefs. Because, you know, if any of us were to say most crimes are committed by Black people, the Klan is going to agree. Neo-Nazis are going to agree. Yeah, Black people have a crime problem. So these are white supremacist beliefs about crime. Now I want to talk about the realities. There is a link between racism, racist beliefs, racist institutional practices, or racist discrimination, and economic oppression, what I think of as enforced poverty, because generally speaking, people are trapped in poverty. Most folks, and especially, this is especially the case with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, most people of color will not escape poverty, will not leave poverty in their lifetimes. And it's not for lack of trying or a lack of desire. They are trapped. So there's a link between racism, economic oppression or poverty, and prisons. Racism against Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color drives mass incarceration. Classism, economic oppression against poor people drives mass incarceration. And these oppressions are intersectional, they're enmeshed. Intersectional oppression in the form of racist classism that targets poor people of color, that targets poor Black people, that drives mass incarceration. So again, poor people of color in general and poor Black people specifically are targeted by systems of police, by policing systems, and by the system of mass imprisonment in this country. Racist classism is institutionalized, or we can think of it as being baked into the prison system, baked into the legal system. And the stereotypes of poor Black people and poor Latinx people of color, stereotypes about who commits crimes and stereotypes about prisoners themselves perpetuate these racist, classist systems of power. All right, more on realities. Most prisoners are what class? If I were to ask that question, what answer would you give? Most prisoners are poor. Most prisoners are poor. Do most poor people commit crimes? Most poor people do not commit crimes. Now, this may seem obvious to some of you, but again, when I ask my students, and I've taught thousands, just like many of you or some of you who are here today, when I ask them, do most poor people commit crimes? Most of them think, yeah, they do. So most poor people do not commit crimes. Specifically when we talk about violent crimes, and the data I'm going to show you, the research I'm going to show you is based on government statistics, the Bureau of Justice, US government statistics, the Bureau of Justice, FBI reports. So poor whites, when it comes to violent crime, there are really similar crime rates among the various races of poor communities. But when you look closer, um, when you look at poor whites and poor white communities and compare the rate of violence or rates of violence in poor Black communities and poor Latinx communities, poor whites commit violent crimes at a slightly higher rate than poor Blacks. And poor whites commit violent crimes at a significantly higher rate than poor Latinxes. But I point this out because the stigma of criminality, the crime is imagined as a Black thing, as a Latinx people of color thing, right? Whites are not stereotyped as criminal, are generally not stereotyped as criminal. Whites are not stereotyped as the perpetrators of violent crime. And yet, the reality is that most crimes are committed by white people, but I'll get there. So this is a visual of the data that I just showed you. Whites have a slightly higher violent crime rate than, poor whites have a slightly higher crime rate than poor Blacks, and significantly higher violent crime rate than poor Latinxes. All right, so more on race and poverty. So a lot on the screen. So I'm going to zoom in on just white folks and Black folks in a moment, but I wanted to present the overall numbers. Now, this is data from 2020 and the pandemic and the mass unemployment that resulted, really not just from the pandemic, but the gross mismanagement of the pandemic and addressing the pandemic by the Trump administration, created greater amounts of unemployment, greater amounts of joblessness, greater amounts of poverty, and illness and homelessness. So in 2020, there's an estimated roughly 39.5 million poor people in the United States in 2020. That's about 12% of the total US population. Now, when we break that down along lines of race, 10% of white people are poor. 10% of white people are poor. 21% of African Americans are poor. Now, this is based on government data and government measurements. The numbers of poor people are higher in each group, but I'm just going to go with what the information that the government is, or the data that the government is giving. So I want to point out that again, most of my students think that most Black people are poor. Most Black people are not poor. Too many Black people are poor, right? Too many people are poor in this country, but most Black people are not poor. According to the government, 89% of Black people are not poor. So 10% of white people are poor, 21% of African Americans are poor, 17% of Latinxes. That includes white Latinxes and Latinx people of color. Government didn't separate them out, those groups out. 9% of Asian. Now these numbers are complicated, but because of time, meaning that there's a much higher poverty rate among Southwest Asians, Southwest Asian immigrants and Southwest Asian Americans, but Asian Americans, there's a 9% poverty rate. In Pacific Islanders, a higher poverty rate at 16%. 23% of Indigenous people are poor. 17% of Arab Americans are poor. And 27% of Middle Easterners and North African immigrants are poor. But what I want you to see here is that the poverty rates of non-white people, the poverty rates of Black, Latinx people, Asian American people, Indigenous people, and so on, they're higher. They're higher. The Black poverty rate is double the white poverty rate. But I want to make something else clear. Most poor people in this country are white. About 56% of poor people are non-Latinx white. If you look at the top line at the top of my slide, 39.5 million, 39 of the 39.5 million poor people, most of those poor folks are white. So most poor people are white. There are about 17.3 million non-Hispanic poor white people, non-Latinx poor white people. So there are about 17.3 million poor white people in this country. There are about 8.5 million poor Black people in this country. So there are many, many, many more poor white people in the country. But what's important again about this number, that 17.3 million, that's 10% of all poor white people. The 8.5 million, that's 21% of poor Black people. So what I'm pointing out is that the Black poverty rate is disproportionately high. A greater percentage, a greater proportion of Black people are poor, but they still don't make up the majority of poor people, right? And there's still way more poor white people in the country than there are Black people, poor Black people. But that disproportionality, right? That overrepresentation of poverty among Black people, that's really important. So again, most poor people are white. Black people have a higher poverty rate. Black people are disproportionately poor. And non-whites in general, Black, Indigenous, people of color in general are disproportionately poor. In general, they have higher poverty rates than white folks. And so what does it mean? And I could spend way more time on this. I don't have, I'm not going to be able to. But people in poor Black communities are living with certain systemic conditions, living under certain or in certain systemic conditions, and with certain structural inequities and structural conditions. And here are some of them. There are either no jobs in their community, literally no jobs, depending on where they are in the country, or the jobs are low wage, they're poverty wage jobs. They don't pay enough to allow them to put food on the table and pay the electricity bill and buy a car, maintain insurance on that car, put gas in the car, pay the rent, right? Poor Black people, like a lot of poor people in the country, have to make choices about what bills are going to pay. So there are either no jobs in the community, or the jobs are poverty wage jobs that don't allow them to leave poverty, to access the kind of resources and opportunities that will allow them to leave poverty. Inferior housing, housing that is unsafe, that is neglected by the people that own that housing, by the government, for example. Most poor Black folks, over 70% of Black folks, live in or near communities that have toxic waste, that are polluted. So environmental racism is shaping conditions in poor Black communities. There's no healthcare, or there's inferior healthcare. There are no social services, or access to inferior or too few social services. They're under-resourced school systems. And what I mean by that, I'm not just talking about funding and there not being enough funding. That's the case with many of the schools in poor Black communities. But things like kids don't have desks, or don't have doors on their classrooms, don't have teachers that are properly trained. Or the conditions in the schools are unsafe. I mean, the list really does go on and on. And then in addition to all of this, these communities are over-policed, and there's an over-incarceration. There's just this poor Black people are locked up at an extremely intense and fast pace. Now, I didn't create a slide for it. But the poverty conditions that poor white folks experience are different. There are white people that live in very similar poverty conditions, but most poor white people, and I will, before I say what's coming next, I am not diminishing anyone's experience of poverty. Poverty creates tremendous suffering for anyone that lives in poverty, for everyone that lives in poverty. What I am saying is that poor white people, so poor Black people, for example, are more likely to live in more extreme poverty and more concentrated poverty. So live in neighborhoods where everyone is poor, or most of the people in the neighborhood are poor. Most poor whites will live in communities that have social services, better social services, that are under-policed. There isn't the same assumption that poor white people, there are horrible stereotypes about poor white people, but them being poor white folks being crime prone, violent, gang involved, these are not stereotypes that stalk poor white communities. And therefore, police are, they're not hyper policed at all, and not policed in the same ways. So poor white folks are living in tough conditions, but there are more resources available to them than there are poor Black people, the research shows. So now I want to talk about mass incarceration, mass imprisonment. There are 10.3 million people imprisoned worldwide. And of those 10.3 million people, the United States locks up 20%, 1/5. That's a heck of a lot. The US has 5%, and actually I think it's 4%, 4% of the world's population, but locks up 20% of the world's prisoners. And the United States, many people in the United States, including the government officials, will declare the U.S. as a symbol of freedom and democracy around the world. This is not necessarily what the U.S. represents to people outside of the country, but people in the U.S. and certainly government officials tend to talk about the U.S. in this way. It's a symbol of freedom and democracy around the world, and yet it incarcerates more people. The U.S. incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. The state of California alone locks up more people than England, France, and Germany combined. Just that one state. And so here's an image that just gives you an idea, of a visual idea of how far outpaced other countries are in incarceration rates than the US. The US is the purple line at the very top. So when I talk about mass incarceration, I'm talking about prisons, policing, and more. And so mass incarceration, institutional racism in the form of mass incarceration, is expensive. Taxpayers pay roughly $182 billion to maintain the system of mass incarceration. And this image shows all the different components: policing, healthcare, food, utilities, not for prisoners, but for people who are working in the prisons, and people and police. So the system of mass incarceration is really expensive. And that money, I don't even think it's an argument. That money would be much better spent on improving conditions in the communities that are racially targeted by police, in communities that are subjected to over-incarceration. So what is driving mass incarceration? Systemic racism drives mass incarceration. So there are many forces. And systemic racism is one of them, in the form that I've already talked to you about: no jobs, poverty wage jobs, inferior housing, pollution, toxic waste, no healthcare, and so on. Over policing and over incarceration. I'm going to focus on the drastic increase in the prison population that occurred in the early 1980s. So in the 1970s, President Nixon, Republican Richard Nixon, declares a war on drugs. It really doesn't pick up steam until the Reagan administration is in office in the early 1980s. What you're seeing here, sorry, I'm trying to clear my screen. What you're seeing here is the prison population. It just surges starting in the 1980s, and that surge in the prison population corresponds with, or is a consequence of, a result of the war on drugs, or the so-called war on drugs. So the so-called drug war is driving the mass incarceration, is one of the forces driving the mass incarceration of poor people of color. And I say, war on drugs, so-called war on drugs, and put it in quotes, because it's not so much a war on drugs as it is a war on poor people of color. And I'm going to explain to you why shortly. So was crime increasing or dropping when the drug war surged? Crime was decreasing. Since the early 1990s, the crime rates, overall crime rates, violent and nonviolent crime nationally, has dropped by 50%. But even as the crime rate drastically decreased, incarceration rates drastically increased. And crime rates weren't dropping because more people were getting locked up. There's lots of research that shows that there's no connection there. As the crime rate was falling, more and more police were put in poor Black and brown communities. So if you look here, when the drug war really picks up steam in the early 1980s, there's an initial decrease in crime, peaks for a period of about 5 years, but again, in the early 90s, it drops. And that's all categories of crime. Violent crime rates have dropped since the early 1990s. And I have this slide here because I'm speaking in generalities. I'm talking about national averages. If we look at certain rural areas, certain suburban areas, certain urban areas, we will see dips and increases, hills and valleys in crime rates. But overall, crime rates have increased. I'm running out of time. So what I wanted to point out here, we've now the administration, the presidential administration has changed. I, for one, am supremely grateful for that. But for 4 years of the Trump administration, and President Trump himself was shaping the thinking of millions and millions and millions of people in the United States. 70 million people voted for this, a person that regularly espoused racist ideas. He was explicitly racist. He was unapologetically racist. He embraced white supremacists and neo-Nazis and said a lot of racist things himself. Here's a quote here, and I'll just summarize. He constantly told lies. He constantly told lies. He said the murder rate, and when he was running for president in 2016, he said the murder rate had never been higher in 45 years. But this, as you can see, and as I've told you, the murder rate dropped significantly in the last 20 years. All right, so racist gender beliefs about crime. And so I turned to Trump's tweets again because his beliefs influence the thinking of millions and millions of people, roughly at least 70 million people, most of them white. But his thinking also reflects the way that millions and millions of people, and most of them white, think. So again, I'm not saying that every white person thinks this way, but way too many white people think this way, and some people of color think this way as well. So I was particularly disturbed by this tweet. If you look at it, it's blurry, but if you look at it, I mean, just the image of what is supposed to be a Black man in the baggy pants and the gun and holding the gun sideways, and then I mean, that alone is racist stereotype of Black men. But he tweets out these statistics, and I'll just summarize it for you, where he's saying that most white people who are murdered, he's saying that most white people that are murdered are killed by other Blacks, and it's simply not true. If you look, most white people that are killed by other whites. In fact, most crime in general, violent crime and nonviolent crime, it's committed by people of the same race, or people are targeting people of the same race. So when white people are beaten, are targeted for sexual violence, are robbed, are killed, most of the time it's other white people doing it. I mean, I'm just gonna have to skip all the racist stuff that Trump said. So how do these racist beliefs, how these racist stereotypes, again, show up in media? Just one example. I mean, over and over and over, I'm not the only person who's seen mugshots on billboards when you're driving down the highway in New Jersey, mugshots always of Black men and brown men, mugshots in the media. And so this is a really great example. The same news station, and showing all white reporters or white news journalists at the top there, the same news station representing theft, burglary. The racial representation of burglary is done in a really obviously disparate or different way. These three white guys are arrested for burglary, and we see a picture of them, high school photos or college photos. They're in suits and ties and smiling, the one in the middle. And then Black men who are arrested for burglary. I mean, I'm not going to characterize. I don't need to characterize the images for you. The Black men look menacing and tough and represent a thug stereotype, and these white boys are essentially sweet and kind and good. They made a mistake. They accidentally stole something. We're led to people who are looking at these images and hearing the reports are really encouraged to have a greater degree of sympathy for these white kids who are arrested versus these Black men, right? I'm sure they're very similar in age, at least 3 of them, but are supposed to have a greater degree of sympathy for them. So the crime rate is while the crime rate is declining, imprisonment rates are increased by 500%. And I am going to rush through this last part. So the total number of people in jails and prisons, 2.3 million in the United States. And when we count people who are on probation and parole, that number balloons to 7 million. Women prisoners comprise about 10% of that number. About 231,000 of the people that are locked up in the US are women. And women in prison, and not just men are experiencing this too. Prisoners of all gender, trans prisoners are experiencing this too. But prisons are horrible places. Jails and prisons are generally horrible places. So most women that are locked up, they're poor, they're women of color, they have children, and most of them are survivors of sexual violence. And so they enter carceral institutions, they enter jails and prisons where they're again subjected to sexual terrorism. They're again, they're strip searched, they're beat, which is not seen as a form of sexual violence, but they're strip searched. They're also beaten and raped, and they're not targeted. They're targeted by not just other inmates, and not even mostly by other inmates. They're targeted by the prison guards. So most guards in women's prisons, most of them are men, most of them are white men, and there are critical numbers of prison guards, certainly not all of them, but they're critical numbers that commit acts of sexual violence against women prisoners. And when women prisoners are targeted for sexual violence, they especially target at higher rates lesbians, bisexual, and queer women prisoners, trans prisoners, prisoners living with mental illness, and most of women prisoners are suffering from some form of PTSD because they are survivors of violence. They target queer women of color with mental illnesses, and so on. So no other country locks up more women than the United States. And so here are the numbers. Now, what I will say about this is that most women in this country are white. Most women in this country are white. And again, most people that commit crimes are white. White women are less than half. I'm not advocating prisons, right? Prisons are a problem. But if you're when people are locked up, the rates of conviction and the rates of incarceration, the prison population should reflect who's committing the crimes, and it doesn't. Less than half of the prison population is comprised of white women. Black women are about 32% of the prison population. Latinas are about 16%, and then Asian American, Indigenous, and mixed race people are about 6%. And these are disproportionately high prison rates, right? African American women are about 12% of all women in this country, and yet they're 32% of the prison population. White women are about 64% of all women in the country, and they're less than half of women that are locked up. And we see the same thing with male prisoners. Most prisoners are men. About 2 million prisoners are men. 40%. So Black men, most prisoners are not Black. Most prisoners are non-white. BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, make up the majority of prisoners together when they're all put together. Black men, Black people, and Black men make up the largest imprisoned racial group, but they're not the majority. So about 40% of male prisoners are Black, 37% are white, 15% Latinx. Sorry, I got to zoom through this. And here's a visual for folks that are just easier to see. The total population of U.S. population on the left, and then the prison population on the right. Whites are underrepresented in the prison population. Blacks are overrepresented. The other groups are overrepresented as well. This graph doesn't show that. I'm going to ask you to trust me on the research. So why are Black women and men, why are people of color disproportionately imprisoned? Why are most prisoners people of color? Roughly 52%. Why are most prisoners people of color? Why are Black males the largest imprisoned group? Why? So one of the reasons, since 1993, most newly convicted Blacks, so Blacks that are locked up that are convicted every year of a crime, most newly convicted Blacks are locked up for nonviolent, low-level drug crimes. 40%, that's a huge chunk, 40% are locked up for smoking weed or selling weed. Why is that the case when most drug users, well over 70% of drug users, are white? Most drug dealers are white. White youth are more likely to possess drugs, yet Blacks are convicted of drug crimes at 10 times the rate of whites. White youth, right? So when we look at the rates of drug use among the various races, they're very, very, very similar. I mean, fraction of 0.1, 0.2% the differences, right, among the races. But when we look closer, when we look at white kids ages 12 to 17, white kids are using crack, LSD, cocaine, heroin, and meth, for example, at far higher rates than Blacks, at 7 to 8 times the rate of Blacks. Most crimes are committed by white people. Most nonviolent crimes, most violent crimes are committed by white people. Why are most prisoners Black and Latinx? Why are Black and brown people locked up for crimes? Why are Black and brown people locked up for drug crimes that white youth are committing at way higher rates? And the answer is simple. I mean, the manifestation is complex, but it's racism. If the majority of people that are committing crimes are white, that are arrested and that are convicted, why aren't they reflected in the prison population? What's happening there? And so some of what's happening, Black people they're not the majority of people arrested, but they're arrested at higher rates. In many all white areas or majority white areas, Black people will be the majority of people that are arrested. They're convicted at higher rates. They get longer sentences. Whites are paroled at higher rates. And also white drug users are far more often sent to drug rehab, whereas Black drug users are sent to prison. Black people are also more likely to go to prison for crimes they did not commit. Just really quickly, again, the FBI and Bureau of Justice Statistics show that white men specifically commit most violent crimes. They commit most rapes, most assaults. 45 million Blacks. Now, they're 45, taking a little closer look at exactly how many Black folks are committing crimes. There are 45 million Black people, roughly 45 million Black people in the US. Less than 1% of Black males will commit a violent crime in their life. Less than 1%. In fact, 1/100th of 1%. Way less than 1% of Black men are going to commit a violent crime. 0.02% of Black people are going to commit murder, are going to kill. And yet, as white anti-racist Tim Wise says, how can such a small percentage of the Black population justify and motivate the widespread over-policing, stops, searches, and harassment of Black people? So there's this belief again that Blacks are violent and criminal and crime prone, and that young Black men are these stereotypical gang banging thugs, when 99.9% of Black people will never commit a violent crime. 98% of Black people will never commit a crime, period. And I want to point out too that the rates of, my assumption is that there are more white people committing crimes that are actually documented on paper, because white communities are under-policed. They're under-policed. So again, most whites when whites are killed or beaten, they're mostly targeted by white folks. 6 times more likely to be killed by another, white people are 6 times more likely to be killed by another white person, 4 times more likely to be beaten by another white person. And I'm just pointing out really the fiction, the lies of these everyday racist habits of thinking about crime. I want to wrap up. So I wanted to talk about white men's violence and how whether or not white men are in the streets protesting or demonstrating or advocating for their Second Amendment rights, and they're showing up in protests. This was actually a protest to stop the tearing down of monuments to slavery and lynching, Confederate monuments. But white men will show up in public, in a Target, in a Walmart, or in protests like this one, in military garb, and have automatic weapons, machine guns on them. And cops are generally not concerned about that. And we saw this manifest in an extreme way recently in the Capitol riots. There more than one thing was happening in the lack of preparation or the lack of police presence there, the lack of presence of the National Guard. More than one thing was happening, but certainly there was not this expectation. There isn't when white folks, and I'm really talking, I'm talking about a lot of how many white people think now, right? Because people of color don't necessarily have these same ideas about white people who are gathering in large groups. But white people, white news reporters for weeks now and still are just expressing this surprise at what happened at the Capitol, right? These white men, this overwhelmingly white group of white people, most of them white men, storm the Capitol, and they want to hang Mike Pence and shoot Nancy Pelosi in the head and kill other congressional representatives. So surprised. This is not who we are. This is unprecedented. It's actually not unprecedented. It's business as usual. White mobs are not unusual in this country. I mean, this country was founded on the mass murder of indigenous people and the mass enslavement and the mass rape of Africans and African Americans. But this was, a lot of people were just shocked by this. A lot of white people were shocked by this. I wasn't shocked by this. And there was a lack of presence of police. But when Black people show up to protest, when majority Black crowds show up to protest or this is how the National Guard, I mean, many of you seen this image. This is how they showed up at were posted at the Capitol when Black Lives Matter protesters demonstrated. And this is an image I think really, really clearly shows, is emblematic, is representative of how police show up when Black people are peacefully demonstrating, right? They're militarized. They're soldiers. They have machine guns. This guy has a bag and a baseball cap, and he's confronted by these police officers on the sidewalk. This is Ferguson, Missouri, after Mike Brown was murdered. A black kid was murdered. Black boy was murdered by a police officer in 2014. But the police occupy Black communities, whether or not our communities are protesting. And again, it's these everyday racist habits of thinking, this expectation that Black people are violent and that poor Black communities are havens of crime. And they're not havens of crime. Yes, crime happens in poor Black communities. Crime happens in all racial communities across class lines. And I'm not, and if anybody wants to talk about there are some disproportionately high rates of crime in poor Black communities and poor communities of color, but they're not anywhere near what the average person tends to imagine. They're just not. So how do we address these problems? How do we make change? There has to be a radical shift in thinking. Number one, there has to be a radical shift in thinking. So poor women who commit crimes, most of them commit crimes, they're stealing, they're dealing drugs, they're doing sex work. These are crimes of economic survival. These are crimes that poor women are doing because they cannot feed, clothe, and shelter themselves and their children any other way. So they steal, they deal drugs, they do sex work. And also, when you don't have healthcare, you can't go talk to a therapist, you can't go see a doctor. Drugs are a way to self-medicate and deal with the trauma of poverty and the trauma of violence that, again, most poor imprisoned women have experienced. So rather than think about those activities as crime, right? Or I'll say it this way, many crimes that prisoners, for which prisoners are convicted, they can be thought of, and in my opinion they're a type of work, they're a consequence of discrimination, and they're a tool of survival. So one way to think about it is that the choices between stealing or starving, dealing drugs or starving, sex work or starving. So that drug dealing is a business, sex work is a business, and even stealing is a kind of business activity because it's undertaken, again, for economic survival. So one thing that we could do is, and that's happening in different parts of the country, is decriminalize the drug trade, decriminalize sex work, especially in poor communities of color and poor Black communities. Engage in restorative justice, transformative justice. And right now, I'll just say very simply that the response to someone who steals or commits violent crime does not have to be lock them up, because prison isn't going to stop that person from stealing or stop that person from committing a violent crime once they're released. Prison actually makes people worse. They're horrible, violent institutions. So find other ways to respond to these activities. And when people talk about defunding the police, they're just talking about taking money away from the police and putting it into schools in poor Black communities. Stop building so many prisons. Don't invest in policing. Don't invest in prisons. Invest in poor Black communities. Put more money into job creation and job training, into food aid, housing aid, into school systems and healthcare and environmental cleanup. Recreate institutional conditions. Generate the institutional conditions that are going to allow people to leave poverty and achieve economic stability. So I do have a conclusion for you. We're 50 minutes in. You've been very kind. I'm going to stop right now and trying to stop. And I'm going to ask. I have 5 minutes more. I have there's 5 minutes more to my talk, so I can stop now and take questions, or I can wrap up my talk. Are there any questions that anyone has?
Yeah, I have a question.
Who's can you tell me who's speaking?
Fies.
Hello, I will. Okay. I can't see you. All right. I hope I can see.
Yeah, I have a question. So I was wondering because I remember that they drafted a bill in 1994 that I think was written by, I don't know if it was written by Joe Biden or if it was voted on by Joe Biden, but they have said that that bill, the crime bill in 1994, caused a lot of increased the prison population by a lot.
Yeah. So I zoomed through it too fast. I wanted, one of the things that I point out is that Bill Clinton, Democratic President Bill Clinton, the prison population was never higher. He did more damage to poor Black people. His administration did more damage to poor Black people than any other administration. So when I talk about everyday racism, and even I talk about Trump and Trump's racism and the racism, if his voters didn't share his beliefs, they certainly supported it. They didn't mind because they voted for him, right? So these beliefs are not specific to a party, and the racist practices are not specific to Republicans and specific to Democrats. Joe Biden played a major role. He was a major author of the crime bill that resulted in the prison population doubling from 1 million to 2 million. And yet, am I relieved to see that white man as president? Absolutely, because he's not a Nazi. But like, that's a really low bar. Not being a Nazi is a really low bar for my supporting you as a human being and as a Black genderqueer person for a president. You should just not be a Nazi. But what I'm saying is, you know, Joe Biden is I'm sure he's a fine person, but he's racist just like everybody else. And it is my opinion that all of us have internalized some kind of prejudice. He's racist just like everybody else. And if we think of ourselves, and especially white folks, and I am gonna do my conclusion after I take a couple more questions, if that's okay, unless you really, really, really just want to talk. But if we tell ourselves that because we're liberal, because we're Democrat, because we're leftist, because we're radical, because we're progressives, if we tell ourselves that we are not racist, that we are not sexist, that we're not classist, that we're not prejudiced, we will absolutely, in fact, we are part of the problem. Because when someone tells you that you have done them harm, because you will, because we're human and we make mistakes, because being racist is you know, we're born into it, right? The same racism that got me that had a cop pushing me around, that same racism I myself internalized. So if we tell ourselves that that's not us, I'm not racist, and I think that's as bad. I don't see race. If you don't see race, you can't see racism. Please see race. Please see race, and acknowledge that you too have racism. And now you can do something about it. Now you can do something about it. If you say it's not there, not a thing you can do about it. So I'm seeing that a lot of you actually took my class, and so you essentially heard all that before. Thanks for being here. So I don't know, did I actually respond to your question, Feist? Did that happen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for your answer.
I'm relieved. Does anybody else have a question?
Yes, Dr. Francis, first of all, absolutely stunning presentation. I need to take a class. Thank you for what you've shared. I just would like you to reflect upon, you said it a second ago, you were not surprised, as most African Americans, about what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. What I have been trying to help some other folks to understand is the way we know a person is underqualified and we lift them up. We know they do wrong, we defend them. It's not something new in this country. It's what we as professionals experience, even in our everyday lived experience, even in our jobs. So you get folks who are not qualified, they're defended. You get folks who do wrong, they're defended. And then they are allowed, when I say they, is whoever they are, allowed to live in a space where they're hired and allowed to make mistakes on their journey, but others are expected to be perfect coming in. Can you talk a little about that? Because it's not a surprise. It's part of our everyday lived experience.
So are you asking me to talk specifically about the grossly underqualified, wealthy white male Trump being elected to the most powerful office in the world? Are you asking me to talk about that?
And how the defense, despite, is obvious the case that was made, forget your politics, and then to see how this, oh, we're gonna let this slide, even though we know it's wrong, versus how they would judge another person like Obama maybe, or in that same position.
I mean, there's so much that I could say in response to that. So I'm gonna try to just talk very specifically about Trump and Obama. So Obama had to be, now, okay. Okay, that's super complicated. All right. I want to acknowledge, before I talk about President Obama, I want to acknowledge that President Obama, as president of the United States, he did design and enact violent, white supremacist, neo-imperial policies in the United States and all over the world, right? He's not, in my opinion, right? And in reality, he's not perfect. He really came down hard on Black folks, you know. I think to appease white voters, you know, you don't have to worry about me. I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna favor Black people in my policy. So Obama, I'm not holding him up as necessarily as some hero of the people. He did some really great things, and he did some really, really horrible things. But before Trump, never before had more people been deported from this country, undocumented immigrants deported in this country. It was at its highest under the Obama administration, and that number only eclipsed by the Trump administration. So I'm not holding him up as some kind of hero, but he certainly had to present himself as perfect, right? He had to speak a certain way. He couldn't be detected as angry. He couldn't come out and say things like white racism is a reality. White privilege is a reality. And white people, the masses of white people have to confront that, to think about that and do something about it. He had to talk in gentle ways. He had to talk in ways that wasn't going to offend, essentially wasn't going to offend white people. But he would talk about, he also proliferated, spread stereotypes or reinforced stereotypes, going to the Black church and wagging his finger at the Black congregation and Black men, you got to take care of your kids. Guess what? Black men are taking care of their kids. Most Black men are absolutely taking care of their kids. Stop saying that, right? Stop saying that. And then when it comes from a Black person said it, so it must be true. Actually, it's still a lie. See, this is why I couldn't tell my mom about this presentation, because I'm cussing. That is exactly why I didn't tell her, because I knew it was going to happen. And I got my colleagues. Oh boy. All righty. Okay.
You are killing it, Leigh-Anne, and you know it.
No, I don't know it. I'm actually very embarrassed. But
be uncomfortable. Come on.
Okay, kind of. So, no, like Bill Cosby, pull your pants up. And it's like, okay, so this makes white people feel better. Okay. Now Trump, I mean, yeah, if you didn't vote for him and if you don't like him, he's dumb. He doesn't read. He watches TV. He wraps up work by 6. I'm up at 11 o'clock working, but he's in bed with a cheeseburger at 6. And I'm not even making stuff up to be funny. It's actually true. So I need to calm down so I can actually answer your question. He's not even mediocre. He's legitimately intellectually inferior and wildly incompetent. But why he had sway with a mass of white voters and a delusional, maybe that's not quite, I don't know what's up with Black and brown people, the fraction that supported him, but really his white voters are the problem. I mean, the overwhelming majority of that 70 million, these are white voters. And he held currency with them. His appeal, it wasn't about his ability, it was his racist showmanship. It was his anti-immigrant showmanship. He's coming down hard on undocumented Mexicans. And it was his misogyny, right? Most white women in the first election and the second voted for him, despite the fact that over 20 women accused him of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment, right? So, man, I feel like I actually didn't answer your question. I mean, they're just, yes, white people in general and white men specifically and rich white men are absolutely held to different standards. You know why? Because they make the effing standards. They make them. They do the hiring. They build the institutions. They decide. They make the decisions about who's going to succeed and who doesn't and who hasn't. I'm talking about at an institutional level, right? And everybody else at the bottom of the barrel, like fighting each other, white folks that are economically struggling, confused about who their enemy is. It's not the dude that's working for $1, $3 an hour in the strawberry fields of the South. It's not that undocumented immigrant from Latin America. It's not him. It's not her. It's not those kids, right? It's that man you just elected to office. He don't give a damn about you. And he's not going to do a damn thing to raise your wages and make sure you have health care. In fact, he oversaw mass murder, didn't he? Right? What are you at? We're at over 500,000 people dead. That was the Trump administration. I'm going to stop because I feel like I'm definitely rambling now. Is there another question? I see my colleague. I just feel like I could see you smiling. Is there another question? I can't, I don't know. There's too much happening. So just unmute you. Go ahead, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you, Dr. Francis. When you were talking during your talk, I was really struck by, with questions about language and sort of the rhetoric of criminal justice and its role in how because I'm interested in the fact that you're framing this as like, we got to think about how we think and talk about crime, right? And even what we mean by that. And it's I think it's so important in part because even that word crime is something that I think we have to even trouble, in part because, I'm thinking about, sort of the ways in which with, sort of Katrina, for example, white people found water, Black people looted, like and I feel like a lot of these terms that I'm still hearing in circulation, not just in my classrooms, but just out in the world, are actually sort of reinforcing the stereotypes that you're talking about. Inmate, convict, delinquent. I feel like a lot of this language is still with us. And that it's ultimately sort of reinscribing these ideas that you're talking about. And we definitely saw it at the Capitol. I heard those people being called everything but criminals. Like it was
That's right.
They're terrorists, they're criminals. And like you're hearing people calling them just about all kinds of stuff, militia. I was like, how can we think about like the language, right? Of carceral studies, but also just our everyday language as we talk about this thing that we're calling crime, because a lot of these things only seem to count as crime if you're doing them while you're Black, as you pointed out. So like, how do we intervene in this problem of language is what I'm asking.
I mean, I mean, is there really, that was beautiful. Okay. What I am asking folks to do, and what I'm asking white folks to do, is to really just take a really, like really just sit with reality. Why are we not, okay, how many white boys and white men have to shoot up a school or a concert or a mall before white men scare the shit out of us? Because even after what happened at the Capitol riot, the stigma of criminality and violence is not going to stick to any one white man the way that it does to Black folks. One black person or 5 or 50 in Chicago commits a crime, and that sticks to all of us. And you know what I'm saying is true, because if you have ever felt that shiver just go up your body when a Black man's walking toward, doesn't matter what time of day, getting in the elevator, you're on a staircase, wherever you are, scared. What is that about? He didn't do nothing. And you know what really makes me sad? What really makes me sad is when a Black man goes out of his way. Hi, how you, just to be friendly and smile. And I'm like, God, man, that sucks, man. You think I'm scared of you. That's because probably a lot of people are scared of you. And that can not just get you arrested and locked up, that can get you dead because somebody thinks you're dangerous. But I'm not really, I mean, I feel that as I tried to express in my presentation, we just need to get real. We need to get real. We need to stop. Well, we got to get informed, and that's the only way we're gonna stop seeing white people as innocent. Okay, just as a group, stop seeing whiteness as innocent and white people as under siege, victimized, right? The victims of these Black and brown hordes. I feel like I'm not giving a satisfactory answer to your question, but I do appreciate your question. I want to say something about Trenton and the way we talk about Trenton at TCNJ. TCNJ campus community that I'm a part of, it's majority white, and there's there are a good number of young people, of people of color, and young people of color there too. But Black students at TCNJ know what it's like to be associated with crime and violence, and know what it's like to overhear conversations or forced to be a part of conversations where white folks are saying stuff about Trenton that's just not true. So I didn't want to put this on a slide because I didn't even want to reinforce it, but even visually. But I'm going to ask you there's a big difference between 2020 and 2019. 2019 and 2018 reflect more accurately reflect the murder rate, specifically the murder rate in Trenton. I want to ask you all, just come up with a number. How many people, especially those of you who've lived in this area a long time, how many people do you think were killed in Trenton in 2019 and 2018? How many people do you think were murdered in Trenton in 2018 and 2019? So in 2019, 15 people were murdered in Trenton, 15. That's too many. That is too many. But it's not blood running in the streets the way that Trenton is talked about on our campus. And white professors specifically warning students, whites, don't go into Trenton. Be careful when you go into Trenton. Why? What's going to happen? You're going to drive through Trenton or walk through Trenton and some black baby and some black grandma just going to just storm you on the street and rip all your shit. I mean, what are we even talking about? Just people. 83,000 people live in Trenton. All of them ain't criminals. Shit, most of them ain't even criminals. What the hell are we scared of? And that fear, you know what it does? It allows us to tolerate, not even to accept, to ignore and accept the institutional neglect of people living in Trenton. And how the school systems are grossly unequal. Trenton is like, what, 10, 13 miles away from where I live. My kids go to a nice, mostly white school. It's really nice because I live in a really nice white area. Not because the white people in it are nice, but because there are a lot of white people here with money. They got money. And so when you don't have it, it's okay to set up a school system where you're going to send your kids to drink water that's got lead in it and breathe in air that's going to make them sick and go to school and not have books, literally not have books to learn math and the reading and the writing that's even going to allow them to go to college. Because I, for one, am personally offended, even though I directly benefit from this white supremacist system. Like, I have a job. Because at a predominantly white institution, in part because of white supremacy. But I'm personally offended that almost everybody that works in the cafeteria, now, please, they should have jobs. Please give people in Ewing and Trenton jobs. But why is almost everybody in the cafeteria Black? But the staff and faculty is overwhelmingly white, and we're essentially in a Black neighborhood. We're essentially in a Black and brown neighborhood. Why is that? And it's not because Black and brown people don't want jobs and don't want to be professors and don't want to go to the college, right? It's because they're intentionally deprived of the resources and the opportunities that are going to allow them to people the college in their own damn backyard. And then, yeah, I am gonna, because I so regret that I didn't say anything. And then I got to be in a meeting with all the other Black and brown faculty, and I got to hear I got to hear a white person say, "Oh, but you know, you're not here because you're not out there. Are you even out there to be hired?" Uh-huh. Yeah, we're out there. I would like to take this opportunity to request that anybody on this campus that isn't an all white or an almost all white department or office, ask yourself why that is and why you haven't noticed and why that's okay with you. And then what you can do to change that. Because that is a conscious decision. It's a conscious decision to continue to maintain an all white or a virtually all white workspace. And then you want to blame it on us because we're not there or we don't want to work there. I would also put to you that if you are going to do what I believe is the right thing and hire Black and brown people, you need to hire a few because it's hard to be the only one because you got to hear stuff like, "Oh, but you guys."
And you have to stop being racist. And they have to stop being racist, Leigh-Anne.
Well, that's
unconsciously racist, microaggressively racist. They have to stop that too.
That requires commitment. That requires a commitment, right? Okay. I was very upset when I heard that statement. I was so upset. I was really, really upset. I don't think that much smoke has come out of my ears in a long time because, I'm alone a lot with twins. Can I read my conclusion? or does someone else want to ask a question?
I think Christopher has his
Go
hand
ahead,
up.
Chris. Is that Dr. Smith?
No, it's Chris.
Oh, it's Chris.
I just wanted to,
Go ahead, doctor.
I just wanted to point out that as someone that has taught in the very areas in high schools in alternative programs, when you talked about education, I think it needs to be said how woefully underserved these areas are. And as someone who taught there, and as someone who had to demand textbooks as an English teacher, you also tapped into something that I think is very important. And Dr. Jackson brought it up, and that's the words we use in the terminology. When we say defund the police, I think the term you used was invest.
Yeah.
And when people hear the word invest, they see a return. And when we can prove that there's a return on actually taking care of humans, and it doesn't matter what color they are, but when we recognize that it is the underserved populations, I ask you, what words do you think should be or could be infused? I know it may not be an on the spot answer, but I think that's part of the problem is the words we use, and people have expectations for words. And if we're going to do that, I think we should start using the right words. We know the ones that separate and divide. Which ones can we use to start actually showing real change?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. I'm going to read my conclusion, and if anybody, I think we're supposed to be finished now. I don't want to. I know if my friends, you can actually leave. If you love me, I know you still love me. But I'm gonna read the conclusion. All right. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for listening. In the United States today, systems of policing and the prison system are mechanisms of and monuments to terror. Racist, misogynist, classist, ableist, anti-queer, anti-immigrant spheres of psychological, sexual, and spiritual terror. A long history of everyday racist stereotypes that assassinate the characters of Black people fuels racist policing and mass incarceration. And the white supremacist beliefs and institutional practices at the core of these systems of power orders the lives of poor Black people. Intersectional systemic racism impacts entire communities of poor Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and negatively alters the lives of many of them for generations. Yes, poor people of color survive. Yes, poor people of color experience joy. And yes, poor people of color resist their oppression. Poor communities of color, poor Black communities included, are also shaped by a long history of trauma induced by systemic racism that converges in the present. Structural racism, the racism embedded in school systems, housing systems, businesses, the healthcare system, the government, the courts, policing, and prison systems. These racist systems and the trauma they yield call upon us to indict today's system of mass incarceration as fundamentally white supremacist. What else can we conclude? When Black and brown people are literally policed, arrested, and imprisoned for crimes that whites commit more of and more often. Whiteness is a license to use and deal drugs, free from public scrutiny and condemnation. Whiteness is a license to even be violent, free from public scrutiny and condemnation. In the 1990s, for example, even though most crack users were white and still are white, crack was and still is demonized as a Black drug. The increase of crack use in poor Black communities was pathologized, branded an epidemic, an infectious disease that should not be treated or cured, but annihilated with militarized police, the foot soldiers of law and order. The white media and a vastly white body of government officials told us that poor Black crack users did not deserve compassion, help, or treatment. Black drug addicts should be quarantined, segregated in soul-killing jails and prisons. Today, however, the surge in opioid use in white suburbs is branded a crisis that we must approach with empathy and address with an acute sense of urgency. There is a growing sense of horror among white government officials, the white media, and white healthcare providers at the fact that increasing numbers of white people are dying from drug overdoses. They say white people that are addicted to drugs need rehab, not prisons. And what is the message here? Drug addicted whites are good people in a bad situation. Black people addicted to drugs are bad people doing what comes naturally, being bad. Today's bad neighborhoods, right? Because people don't use racial slurs. We just say bad neighborhoods are racialized locations, viciously and unfairly stereotypes as havens for welfare queens, crack mothers that birth crack babies who grow into thugs that terrorize their own communities and that of whites. Isn't that the widespread belief? Even though whites commit most crimes, even though most whites who are beaten, raped, robbed, and murdered have been victimized by other white people, many whites live in fear of crime and violence from Black and brown people. These racist fears are used to justify police killings of unarmed innocents, police beatings and executions of Black and brown people whose crimes do not warrant what amounts to a lynching at the hands of a police officer. Ours is the era activists and scholars call the new Jim Crow, where Black people living under police occupation and with the stigmatization of the mainstream white supremacist beliefs that circulate in the media, that animate conversations on predominantly white college campuses. Think of the casually cruel racist beliefs about Trenton's poor Black communities that people at TCNJ express. These racist discourses that are also present in the everyday conversation of many of us, many white folks. In this broader social context, Black people are forced to declare that which should be obvious, that Black lives matter. Shamefully, the validity and preciousness of Black lives does not matter in a white-dominated society whose legal system continually exonerates police that gun down Black children, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, grandfathers, in their cars, in their homes, in their streets, in our streets. Police that murder Black children, even as they sleep in the laps of their grandmothers in their living rooms, which was the case with 7-year-old Ayanna Jones, who was murdered by a white police officer. When Black lives matter to a critical mass of white people, just like the thousands of white people, Asian Americans, Latinx people, Indigenous people, and more, who joined Black people in the protest against police violence that swept the country last summer, when a critical mass of white people have the emotional courage to accept that the reality that whiteness grants them unfair advantages, when that critical mass of white people acts on that knowledge and routinely comes together with people of color to demand, to force institutional change, racist police profiling, racist police murders, racist arrest and incarceration rates, mass incarceration in the crisis conditions it yields in poor Black communities will end. Thanks.
Everyone unmute and clap as hard as you can. Just unmute and clap 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 and clap. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Okay, does anybody, I mean, you do not have to stay, but does anybody, am I allowed to stay? Pam, is Pam there?
I am, yeah, you are.
Am I allowed? Okay.
You are certainly welcome to stay. I saw some folks in the chat that said they could stay here all day, so I don't think you'll be alone.
I might grab a drink of water.
Leigh-Anne, thank you so much. I do want to apologize for the technical difficulties, and for anyone that did get stuck in that other Zoom room. It looks like there were 2 links created, so I think everyone made it over to this one and was able to hear your eye-opening and informative presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pam. And I liked having the extra time personally to prepare, so it's okay. All right, so are we saying goodbye? Anybody want to talk, or go ahead, Pam?
I'm sorry, I am not the host of this one, so I'm not sure.
Hosting.
We've got inclusive excellence hosting.
Yeah, inclusive excellence. And
so with that said, I'm not sure if they will keep the meeting open or if they should open a new room. I'm sorry, I don't want to put that on anyone else. I know you said you're willing to stay, so I'll let someone else step in that has the controls over the meeting.
What would you like to do, Dr. Fulton?
Alex is still here, so we can continue or we can end it. It's up to you.
Yep, meeting can go as long as anyone wants. Just cost some bandwidth.
I would love to, if anybody else wants to say anything.
Can I just talk about a recent statistic I heard that was so crazy? So there's
Yes.
there's a woman who wrote a book, and I'll send everyone the author, but it's about how white resentment against the public good was at 70%. No, commitment for the public good. People can have housing, schools, all those things, was at 70% before civil rights. And it dropped down to 35% in the 60s, and it has never come back. But if policies had been able to close the economic gap between Black people and white people 20 years ago, our collective GDP would be $11 trillion bigger. So it's not just that white supremacy hurts us, Black people. It actually brings us all way, way down. I mean, morally and all the ways that you checked, but also just economically. Those oppressive systems, it's crazy. I just thought I'd add.
Absolutely. Would anybody else like to?
If I can piggyback on the question and comment that Professor Jackson raised earlier about language. One of the trends that I'm seeing in response to the terrorist attack on January 6th on the Capitol is how these white terrorists there's a narrative that seems to be forming that is sort of associating their terrorist behaviors with a form of mental illness. So you have sort of this argument that, oh, somehow they get swept up, right, with the conspiracy theories of QAnon and all these other, sites, almost as if deflecting responsibility. That no, these folks packed their stuff, got their guns, got on the road on purpose, right? And it connects to earlier points that you've made about how white criminality is represented in the media versus Black, behaviors, right? And so it's something that I've been really paying attention to recently, and I keep saying, here it goes again. Even when they have killed police officers at the Capitol, they have wounded so many people, you still have this tendency to associate this criminal behavior with some form of mental, like they didn't mean to do it, that kind of thing. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that, the way in which conspiracy theories are being used as a way of explaining away these terrorist behaviors.
I mean, I haven't thought specifically about that, so I'll address that in a moment. But I want to say that was part of what I wanted to talk about too. Was most mass violence, most terrorist violence, so most attacks on civilians in this country is committed by white men with far right extremist beliefs. But they're not. The stereotypical terrorist is a brown man from the Middle East with a beard. I mean. And actually, in reality, most terrorists in this country, most violence is done by white men, right? And when white men and boys commit these mass shootings, there's an ableism, this ableist, rather than really looking at and addressing the institutional discrimination, oppression, and violence against people with disabilities, with various kinds of disabilities, using disability as a scapegoat, right, to explain away why this white man did what he did. It's everything but the fact that he's infected by a toxic sense of himself as a white man. There's actually and I'm not saying there's something wrong with being a white man, right? Or identifying as a white man. Please see that you are both things, that this gives you privilege in society. I'm talking about a toxic sense of yourself as a white man, that you are owed something, that everything is yours, because what exactly are white men pissed off about? They bought that white supremacist Kool-Aid. They drank that white supremacist Kool-Aid that they should be doing better. They should have the American dream. Ain't no American dream. Or yes, there is. It's a dream. It's a myth, right? You don't get it just because you're a white guy. You're actually not going to be handed economic success just because you're a white guy. And that's what they're pissed off about, right? I should be at the college, or my kids should be at the college, or I should own a house. I should not be financially suffering. And if I am, it's not wealthy white men that are taking something from me, that are keeping my wages low, that are smashing up unions that advocate for my rights, that are suppressing my wages, right? And messing with my healthcare. No, it's not them. It's an undocumented immigrant from Mexico. Right? Before the undocumented immigrant was the one catching hell, it was Black people and affirmative action. Because look how Black affirmative action has made TCNJ. Yeah. Right? We're really taking those campuses by storm, man. White women are actually the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action. Just had to say that really quickly. But yeah, I mean, so it's not just it's mental illness, or they were bullied. Or it's rap music. It's rap music. So Black people gotta be involved somehow. We gotta have something to do with it. It was rap music. It was Snoop Dogg. But as far as the conspiracy, no, it was not the rap music. Okay, it's the country music. So.
Should we wrap? Should we wrap up so Leigh-Anne can get another glass of water?
Anyway, no, I haven't. I think you said it very well, that the conspiracy theories are being used as a scapegoat rather than looking at toxic white masculinity and white racism as a reason for the riots at the Capitol, and white men's the general discontent of those white men who are discontented. What white racism and what white masculinity has to do with it. All right, so it sounds like.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Francis, for dropping the mic more times than the mic deserved. It's like hobbling. For preaching, for being honest. And I want everyone who was surprised about this to come to African American Studies.
That's
because
right.
We teach, we inform, we educate, we change, we disrupt the norms. But thank you.
And gotta shout out to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies too.
Yes, but I only have one job on this campus right now, and it's chair of AAS. Well, actually, I have a few more jobs, but.
All right.
All right, thank you so much, Leigh-Anne.
Thank you so much, everybody.